from the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas. This is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Today we have a special guest. Ambassador Tony Wayne will join the Institute's Center for U.S. and Mexico Director Tony Payan and discuss the past 200 years of the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, which was celebrated in 2022.
So, Ambassador Wayne, tell us a little bit about your experience as ambassador in Mexico, I think 2011 to 2015, am I correct?
That's right.
What was it like to be in Mexico at that time?
Well, first, I arrived directly from Afghanistan.
Oh boy.
So it was going from a war zone to a country certainly with some violence, but with a lot of modernity and a lot of economic activity and a lot of sophistication. So personally, I had to adjust to the different environment that I was working in. But what I came to see very quickly is that our relationship with Mexico is very complex and very intertwined. And it's really, for both countries, it is international and domestic at the same time. The issues are very important for each country, but they're very important for the internal politics and internal economics of each country. So that adds an extra dimension, sometimes emotionalism to the relationship, but also a challenge to work it out. You really do have to work with a wide range of people in both societies as well as in both governments. So we had, for example, at the U.S. Embassy, over 30 U.S. government agencies. We had 2,700 people around the country in the embassy and all the consulates. And the Mexican embassy, of course, the Mexicans have 50 consulates around the United States. So it is a relationship where you get to deal with practically every issue that you could possibly think of coming up. Now, really not everything, but a lot of issues, some of which pass without people noticing, but they're very important to those people that work on those technical issues, and others that are right at the center of the debate. So consistently through this period, when I arrived, the most important issue from the U.S. perspective was getting our support for the Merida initiative actually flowing. And this was an agreement where we would work together with Mexico, the closest we had ever worked before, on public security issues. Not just on fighting criminals, but improving law enforcement practices, improving respect for human rights, helping local communities overcome the problems that they had with a lot of criminal activity. And so that meant that we were starting all sorts of new programs and trying to figure out if we had the right idea for programs or not, if they would work. So that was a very big item. But then we also had this immensely important economic relationship going between the two countries, with 1 million people crossing the borders legally every day with all sorts of goods headed in both directions. And this was a period of growing trade, and it's just continued to grow since then. But what that meant was you had very many technical trade issues that also came up. And you had the issue of tourism, for example. We had tens of millions of tourists in both directions. At that time when I got there, we did not have an open skies agreement. There were very limited flights, and so some of the things we worked on were improving tourism, improving the flight connections between people. We noticed that there were very few Americans studying in Mexico and not enough Mexicans studying in the United States. So we tried very hard to expand those kind of very important human exchanges for the long-term relationship so people can understand each other. Because, as you know, Mexico and the United States have a history of not understanding each other very well.
And I remember you had FOBESI initiative, which was essentially kind of an initiative that you all started to ensure that more students could come and more students could go, so that there'd be this kind of underlying understanding in the population, right?
That's right. And we got, for the first time, the Mexican government actually put $20 or $30 million into this. And we got not quite as much, but a little bit more from the U.S. side. And we got then private foundations and others to contribute. And it was based on the premise that not only would the individuals gain, but that over the longer run, we would have more understanding between the two societies. And of course, that's an effort that needs to continue today.
But I think you benefited perhaps from a consensus that emerged in the 1990s and was still extant during your tenure at the embassy, which was essentially that we have common interests, that we're driving towards integration, that Mexico is a democracy, or at least aspiring to consolidate its democracy. That all changed around 2016 in the United States with the advent of the Trump administration. And of course, in 2018, when López Obrador took office, I guess an ambassador today would not even have the benefit necessarily that the two countries were to see eye to eye on all these issues.
Well, the two countries and the two presidents, of course, are a little bit different things. But you're exactly right. All during this period of time, the 1990s and the 2000s, we were building up more and more areas of agreement that it was more beneficial for the two countries to collaborate than to stand at arm's length from each other. So one of the big evolutions in the years that I was there, we switched the dialogue on cross-border problems and criminality to say that we had shared challenges and we both had to work together to find the solutions. Up until that point, people were quite often pointing to the other side of the border, saying it's your fault, no, it's your fault, going back and forth. So we had this period of several years that I think did last up until the Trump administration, where people really were saying, okay, the only way to do this, we have a shared responsibility to find solutions, so let's work on that. So that was a wonderful window of opportunity, built on all that work that had gone on since NAFTA started, and I think we made some real progress. We have run into a series of challenges in the Trump administration, especially with his approach toward migration and the border, and then with the current administration in Mexico, which really was not interested in deepening close collaboration on the tough public security issues that we faced and increasingly have faced with the flows of fentanyl and synthetic opioids, which are more deadly than the previous drugs and are having more deadly effects in the United States as well as anywhere that they're used.
So what do you think will take for the two countries to converge again? I guess I see it as a way of, there was convergence in the 90s, well into your term at the embassy, and then all of a sudden in the last few years we've seen a divergence of interests, or at least whether it's real or imagined, because I think a lot of it is constructed by the rhetoric and the presidents themselves. The presidents sometimes follow the public rhetoric, but they also build the public rhetoric. And so it's important to understand the complex interrelationship between the two. But now the two countries seem to be diverging a little bit. They don't see eye to eye. There's issues like you mentioned, fentanyl, immigration, border issues, trade disputes and all that. Where are we now? And what do you think will take to again build that convergence of interests and to think shared issues that must be solved jointly? I think I remember the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's, this is a shared responsibility. We don't see that any longer. We think that it's a problem, it's an issue, it's not necessarily shared. Fentanyl obviously has been denied as a problem by the López Obrador administration, so they don't think that they have any responsibility. They may act under pressure, but they really think it's an American problem, so they don't see it as a common problem. What is it going to take in the future to rebuild that consensus that, hey, we're neighbors, we're joined at the hip by 2,000 miles, we need to see eye to eye and maybe collaborate more closely on building a new consensus?
Well, I think it will be very important to see who gets elected in both countries as we go forward, because it really is a shared political will to solve problems and to realize that we can't do it individually that's going to make the difference. And the importance of regional collaboration on economics and on these other big issues, even migration. Many migrants are coming from the South, and some near South, but some far South. They're coming from, there are 20 million people on the move in South America. So I think we need leaders that have a broader vision and that have a longer term vision and not just a short term political vision about how to gain some points in their domestic politics. And that's always hard. It's a rare moment, but those moments do arrive. So I hope in the post-presidential elections in both countries, we're going to have a set of leaders that are willing to look more broadly and more distantly and build on the foundations that are still there to make this work. The one thing that's very interesting is we have all the mechanisms sitting there ready to go in the trade area, even in public security, but in this broader competitiveness agenda, people have started to work. What you really need is that political push from the top of the two countries, and then if you include Canada for all of North America, from all three countries, to push ahead. There's a tremendous potential for North America and for the U.S. and Mexico if we can get this political will behind the many people in most societies that are quite happy to move ahead. For example, if you look at the trade that's taken place, trade has grown in the double digits, 2020, 21, 22, and there's no reason it shouldn't just keep growing. And it's pretty amazing how much it's grown. In fact, you can look at the growth that's taken place in Mexico. Practically all of it is due to the fact that we have the USMCA. There's both the growth in exports to the United States. As you know, Mexico has the largest surplus they've ever had with the United States, and they're getting all these remittances sent back from the United States by Mexicans in the United States. That accounts for most of the economic growth in Mexico. Right. So from that perspective, it's a great blessing that Mexico is next to the United States. Now we have these other challenges, but what you want to do is build on those blessings and address the challenges so they become less of a problem for both countries. And I think I'm hopeful we can have some leaders that have that forward-looking perspective.
Let me ask you a provocative question when it comes to the USMCA. Nobody ever thought that NAFTA would be questioned, and yet it was questioned in 2015, 2016, and then I think the renegotiations of NAFTA began in August of 2017. Finally, the USMCA replaced it, I think, on July 1st, 2020. But it does have a sunset clause in 16 years, and it does have a prerequisite that it should be reviewed and revised in 2026. That's 2.5 years away. So is it in any danger? Do you see any scenario that these two countries might say, we don't need the agreement, we'll just have to trudge along with the general agreements at an international level? Do you see a potential problem there?
I don't think that's likely. And one of the reasons I don't think it's likely is that we've got $1.5 million of trade a minute between the two countries. So there are a lot of people whose livelihood depend on that trade continuing in both countries. What we do have to keep demonstrating is that this trade agreement is working and working well. Right now it's pretty clear it's working just fine, 18% growth, 10% growth in these years. There are a lot of people that are very happy with it. There are some big disputes still brewing that need to be solved, and one of the ones that I'm particularly worried about is the proposal in Mexico to exclude all genetically modified corn, because most American corn farmers from the Midwest grow that corn, and Mexico is a tremendously large market for that corn and has created no problems.
It can cause quite a bit of goodwill on Capitol Hill.
It can cause not only, on Capitol Hill and among all those Midwestern farmers. So I hope we can use the USMCA and the commitments in there to find a solution to that. So you have to show that the USMCA can solve problems as well as allowing the private sector to keep trading with each other. Because it really isn't because of USMCA that the private sector is making all this money. They're ready to do that. But USMCA gives the framework. And if the framework works, and if people show they can find solutions, I think it will stay popular in the United States. If it doesn't, people's opinions are going to change, especially, as you noted, on Capitol Hill, when they look in 2 years, if Mexico's actually banning all the corn that Americans eat all the time, people are going to raise serious questions about that.
So let me ask you another question related to trade issues. I think one of the things that is keeping the relationship together, particularly economically, is the fact that the U.S. is trying to pivot away from Asia. In fact, somebody asked us the question, how can we pivot responsibly away from Asia? And that was an interesting question because it reveals a certain intentionality in Washington to slowly begin to de-link the U.S. economy, especially from the Chinese economy. Mexico is well positioned in between to be the recipient of a lot of that repatriation or regionalization of production chains, manufacturing chains, and things like that. I think that's one of the legacies of the pandemic as well, that the U.S. gained a new awareness of how vulnerable its supply chains are to Asia and so forth. Is Mexico ready to aid the United States in this? Is Mexico aware how much it can benefit from positioning itself in such a way that it can be a partner in this particular geostrategic goal of the United States to begin to regionalize its production? I mean, what needs to happen for this to truly be taken advantage of by both countries?
Well, there's a lot of discussion going on. In fact, they just had a meeting between the three economy ministers 10 days ago about semiconductors and how we could develop better semiconductor supply chains across North America. And there is reshoring to the United States, nearshoring to Mexico and to Canada, and that's happening. And there is a lot of nearshoring going into Mexico. But the consensus of most experts is it could be a lot greater for Mexico if the government of Mexico actually provided incentives and infrastructure investment and other kinds of investment that would make it easier for these new businesses to actually set up, connect to North America and other things. And I think that's one of the areas where I see the current government falling short. As you know, they've had an austerity program under AMLO, and I think they really need to start offering more incentives. Now, they might be sort of getting that idea. I saw they're going to announce a number of proposals for industrial parks along this new Trans-Isthmus Railway, and they're talking about incentives to do that. But I think they could also be offering more incentives in Mexico. What you've seen are a couple of states in Mexico where the governors and others are offering incentives, and they've been attracting more investment, significant investment. And I think there are many businesses interested, and so there's a great potential there. But I think there's a chance you're going to miss that potential if you don't take advantage of it. So I think there's a lot of good work going on. There's a lot of good dialogue going on now. And the United States has passed legislation to make a lot of money available for increasing its competitiveness. I think they're hoping that Mexico and Canada will do more of the same and that we can all move together in North America. Either way, the U.S. right now is trying to bolster those ties across the whole continent because I think strategically they see that it's also true for China and it's true in Europe, that there's this interconnectivity in a region that's helping to make each of those other big competitors, economic competitors, more effective, and that we need to do that in North America. And not only North America, I might add, I think we should be doing it more broadly in Latin America because whereas Mexico has gotten much of U.S. economic attention over the past several decades, the rest of Latin America has gotten very little. And there's a great potential there also as we go forward. And I think in a sense, the pivot away from Asia is sort of misleading. It's not like we should really be disengaging from Europe, but we should, as you mentioned, be looking out for what are the risks, how can we make our supply chains more resilient, how can we have multiple supply chains, how can we reduce the costs and enhance the safety of those chains. And that doesn't mean cutting Asia out, but it means having a variety of different ways that you're actually producing things and you're getting the critical minerals, the critical elements that you need to go forward.
A couple of things. On the way there, there's two bumps on the road. One is obviously fentanyl, which is a big problem, and the other one is immigration. I think I would be remiss if I don't ask you a question about each of them, or maybe together, and you can address them as potential obstacles that don't make the economic ride smoother. How is this going to end? Where are we going on the fentanyl crisis? In the United States, we're obviously losing 110,000 lives to overdoses. That's a very serious problem. Mexico is coming along to acknowledge a certain role, but still reluctant. And of course, on immigration, the countries need each other. It's a complicated thing because Mexico is a transit country and the U.S. is a destination country, so obviously they have different components. Where do you see this going in the next couple of years? How can we get these issues roughly solved and put aside so that we can focus on development?
Well, I think on the fentanyl issue, we just have to address the number of deaths and the amount of seizures of fentanyl coming from Mexico, which have continued to rise. They've grown over 500% since 2019. And even in this fiscal year, which started last October, they've been soaring, the amount of fentanyl coming from Mexico. So clearly, I would say clearly the Mexicans aren't doing their job of intercepting this deadly drug. They have to do better. And it's not that the U.S. at all is innocent from responsibility here. We have to reduce demand. We have to take care for those people who are susceptible to addiction or get addicted. The U.S. has allocated up to about $40 billion now to these kind of programs, which is a really positive change. And our law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border need to be more effective cooperating amongst themselves, but that bilateral cooperation has to get a lot better. The amount of trust between agencies on both sides of the border has deteriorated significantly over the past 10 years. And we have to find ways to rebuild that and do it urgently. And I think that's a very, very urgent need. We've seen some signs that the governments in Mexico and the United States have recognized that. There were some interesting sanctions by the United States just the other day to Mexicans and Chinese for bringing in pill-making machines that the cartels are using to turn the fentanyl into pills that look like legitimate prescription drugs. And that's a good sign, but we've got to do a lot more of that. Now, related to that, just from the Mexican perspective, they complain on a regular basis about, with some reason, about arms coming from the United States into Mexico. We've known the solution to this for a long time, which is that Mexico, as well as the United States, should be looking for arms coming in. It's not like those arms fly from Dallas to Mexico City or Guanajuato or other places. They cross the border. So we should just agree that we're going to be much more serious about looking for arms. You can, with scanners, if somebody has a gun in their car, they drive through the scanner, you're going to see that there's a gun in that car. You could stop it. It's the same thing headed northward. These sophisticated scanners that we have now are much better at detecting drugs, even synthetic drugs, than we've had previously.
So do you think the strategy of suing gun makers or distributors in the United States is probably effective for propaganda purposes and things like that, but it's not really the solution?
I think that it is drawing attention to the problem. It might end up being helpful in the sense that it would make some manufacturers more careful about who they're selling to. So it might be part of a solution. But the real solution has to include Mexicans actually just being more careful about what cars and trucks are coming into their country, entering their country, have with them. And the same thing for in the United States. We have to be better also and smarter at our borders. And I often say it's not like the drugs are shot in a catapult from El Paso or Ciudad Juarez to Chicago. They drive, they're driven by somebody. So we've got to get better at tracking that down also and stopping things in both countries. That's going to take real trust and real collaboration. And we just don't have the situation right now where people really have that confidence in each other that they can share confidential, secret information to actually go after criminals on a concerted basis. We've got to get there.
So in the last 2 minutes, immigration, where are we and where are we going?
Well, I think the end of COVID forced the United States to come up with a series of steps to bring more order to the border, because they couldn't use the legal method they were using previously to send people back. And so there are a number of stopgap measures, which are a mix of reinforced enforcement, of threats of being banned from the United States for 5 years if you get caught trying to come across and claim asylum when you haven't done the appropriate steps to get there. Cooperation with Mexico to take a number of these people from Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba back, with the United States can't easily send back places. And then also the United States trying to expand the amount of people who can come in legally. This commitment to take 30,000 Venezuelans, Haitians,
I think
Cubans.
Canada accepted another 15,000.
And Canada took a few more, and the Spanish have even said they'll participate. And then this broader effort to get all the countries in the passageways to accept, to care for people better, to go after smugglers, to try to offer themselves to absorb some of these people. What we're experiencing in the Americas is a very serious problem, but the same thing's happening in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. There are a record number of people on the move. So it's a problem we have to keep addressing and get smarter at addressing. We need immigration reform in the United States also. It's way overdue. We can't process people as quickly with, the backlog in the immigration court is just massive and growing. Mexico has to get a lot better in how it cares for and takes care of migrants. It has refused over several administrations to invest in its refugee and border services in a more effective way to take care of people passing through. And we have to remember that the second largest group of people coming to the United States are Mexicans.
Right.
They
again.
Up from 2007 through 17, the number of Mexicans irregularly in the United States declined by 1 million.
We were even talking about net zero or even negative migration.
It was a million less between 2007 and 2017, or 2010 and 2017. And now it's been growing now for recent years. So somehow people want to leave Mexico. Now, many of them are in fact returned to Mexico, but that's a problem that needs to be addressed also.
Well, lots to talk about. Ambassador, I think we've run out of time in this podcast, the Baker Briefings. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again here at the Baker Institute.
Well, thank you, Tony. From one Tony to another Tony. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. Planning support was provided by Lisa Waqueta. AV production was led by Kevin Young. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more.